Hello everyone and welcome to another podcast on the Resibuild Constructive Conversations. Today we're going to be looking at the key issue of housing crisis and unravelling what does it really mean? What are the pain points and what are the solutions to actually making those targets a reality? We're going to look in the context of MMC and whether MMC and offsite have a role to play. I'm glad to be joined today by Jessie Wilde from Housing Festival. She's an expert in the field of social housing and will help us to unravel some of this information. Perhaps if you could start off, Jessie, by welcoming you and asking you to perhaps give us a bit of a background as to who you are and what your role and background is.
Yeah, of course. So my name is Jessie Wilde and I've been working with the Housing Festival since its inception really. So myself and the other director kind of co-founded it back in 2018. And really the heart behind the Housing Festival was to look at how do we help with the housing crisis. It was really quite a naive journey, if I'm really honest. It was very much a sense of, surely it can't be that hard to help with the housing crisis. Surely, obviously, how wrong we were. So we set out with a sort of ambition to look at curating conversations, helping to bring experts together, really looking at, there's lots of different experts, but they don't always talk to each other. They're sort of set up in different silos. You've got public and communities over one side who know what they need as part of a city or a town or what have you. You've got politicians and local authority people. You've got the experts in the private sector that have real specific skills and knowledge. But so often all these different sectors and so many more were and are just not really speaking to each other. And so we very much came in with a mindset of how can we curate conversations, how can we bring different experts together across those different sectors to form conversations that will push the conversation forward. And very early on, we recognised the opportunity of MMC, particularly the modern methods of construction, off-site manufacture, not as this silver bullet that's going to solve the housing crisis, because it's not, but MMC has this opportunity to really ask different questions because it operates differently, because it pushes business models, because it asks different questions about how you look at value. It forces everyone within a build system to ask different questions and rethink process. And so you've got this real opportunity to dig into, right, how do we value things? Are we really costing up the fact that I need to retrofit that house that's just been built in 10 years' time? Do we really put that in? Do we think about lifestyle costs? Do we think about the speed of delivery and how much that's going to save, or how much more that delivers? When you bring in MMC, you've got to ask some of those questions to make it all stack up. So I think we very quickly realised, actually, this is a real key driver behind what needs to change and what needs to be put in place to see innovation deliver new housing and more affordable housing and social rent housing. So that's been really the focus, and my role within the Housing Festival has just sort of grown from that, really.
Yeah, okay. So a lot of different bits to unpack there, and we'll touch on a number of those points to go through. Now, I know you've been involved in Bristol more generally. Is there other experience you've had in that area?
In terms of other things that I've done in Bristol, or within
your involvement in social housing and the other aspects of your background?
Yeah, so fascinatingly, I have not got any kind of background in housing. So my background is sort of charity sector, social outreach, social interventions, I suppose. I've been a youth worker. I've done work on anti-slavery and anti-human trafficking, and came into the housing sector really by accident, so the story goes. And honestly, it's been a real eye opener. And that's where the naivety comes in that I spoke about earlier, in terms of coming into the sector going, oh, we just want to make a difference, we just want to help. Surely it can't be that difficult to help with the housing crisis. There's the naivety when you haven't been involved. But it's been really interesting. The sort of thread through my career, particularly in Bristol, I've been in Bristol for years and years, was around that idea of how do you help different people from different sectors speak to one another to support a common cause. And so it was those skills that I brought into the Housing Festival and how we sort of got set up. It's how do you have different conversations? How do you do that translation work between the different languages that different sectors speak? Because you've got different priorities and different outlooks. You will speak slightly different languages, and that translation work sometimes is really important.
Yeah, that's interesting, because in the construction industry, we hear housing crisis as a buzzword, which we've talked about for countless years.
Yeah.
The reality is, I'm not sure how much in the construction industry we really feel the pain up there. And I wanted to start off just by going back to kind of more grassroots on the housing crisis. Is we're missing the targets. We're seeing that time and time again. We've got really ambitious targets being set in the manifesto of the new government. Who's currently feeling the pain, and where are those people being housed? I'm more thinking in terms of the organisations rather than the individuals being affected here. But what was your take on that?
I mean, to not quite answer the question first off, I think if you could argue that for some people, particularly homeowners, and I mean, I'm a homeowner, for those of us that own houses, you could argue that the housing crisis is really good for us. And that's a really uncomfortable thing to say and a really uncomfortable truth. But actually, with house prices rising and land value increasing and the way that our markets work, it's actually really good for us.
Yeah,
my investment is growing. Yeah. And that's really uncomfortable, because I also, on a day-to-day basis, I work, at the moment, one of my projects is working around temporary accommodation and working with a local authority, specifically looking at how you can support innovation to tackle some of the real financial challenges around temporary accommodation. But we're talking about £1.7 billion per year that's being spent of taxpayers' money on the temporary accommodation crisis. Now, when I say temporary accommodation, I'm not talking about temporary housing, not houses that are temporary, but temporary accommodation in this context is a sort of tenure type. So when local authorities have people come and knock on their door and say, I'm homeless, I've got nowhere to go, I've got small children, or I'm vulnerable, or the local authorities have a duty to house a certain number of people, and a certain kind of threshold of people that are experiencing a vulnerability, particularly children is a great example, those with children. And so they have to house those people, and they're put into housing that is then known as temporary accommodation, because it's designed to be for a temporary period. And so things like bed and breakfasts are used, because local authorities, a lot of them don't have enough of their own stock to use for this. So you end up having to use bed and breakfasts, hotels. You have to use just really expensive, poor quality private rent accommodation. You know, we talk about those office tower blocks that get converted into tiny little apartments that are just not fit for purpose, and they're then, you know, sold on to local authorities for use as temporary accommodation, designed for small amounts of time. The challenge is, because we have a housing crisis, we don't have enough social rent housing in this country, and so people end up stuck in TA, temporary accommodation, for such a long time. Sort of, you know, it's not uncommon for a family to be in that for 2 years. So you've got, you know, household, real children living in these really poor conditions. I mean, imagine living in a hotel for 2 years. I mean, it sounds all glamorous and fine, you know, oh, well, great. But they're not, you know, they're not getting room service every day. It's not, they've got nowhere to cook. They've got nowhere to unpack. They've got nowhere to really live life.
No garden.
Exactly.
No balcony.
Exactly. None of that. So you've got all these households, and we're looking at about 120,000 children currently in temporary accommodation. It's just huge. And obviously there's the cost, but local authorities are bearing that cost. So local authorities have a right to claim back from national government a certain amount of the cost that temporary accommodation covers, and it's linked to local housing allowance rates and all that kind of stuff. But there's always a shortfall. When you're using hotels, bed and breakfast, when you're using private rental accommodation, there's always more that it costs over and above what they can claim from national government, which means local authorities, as the challenge is growing of the number of people not being housed and not in homes, you've got this growing financial pressure for local authorities. And we've seen a number of local authorities in recent months declaring bankruptcy or declaring that they're in financial problems, and citing, not as the only factor, but as one of the significant factors, rising temporary accommodation costs. I mean, this is the sharpest end of the pain of the housing crisis. But ultimately, we're in this position because we've got our rental system is overheating and people are needing to pay so much to rent homes. And then, something happens, like we've got this cost of living crisis people talk about, and suddenly you can't afford your rent. And you end up in this position where you can't stay where you are. And we don't have enough social housing in this country anymore. We've been building and building and building, and build rates have dropped off, and right to buy rates have increased, and demolition rates have increased. So it's great that we've got the housing targets that we have in this country, and we've had them for the last few years. Like, it's not new, that might be new targets, but targets aren't new for housing delivery in the country. Our challenge is we're in a net loss. So we've got a net deficit of housing that we need, the social housing specifically that we need in this country. And that shift isn't changing. We just can't build quick enough.
So is that something which can be easily reversed, in your opinion?
Easily, no. Reversible, yes. I think George Clark, shelter, crisis, they're all talking about this sort of magic number of sort of 90,000 to 100,000 social rent homes, somewhere in that we need a year. But not just houses, actual social rent homes that we need that year. There's lots of campaigns to relook at right to buy as a policy. All of this is great to be talking about, but until we can actually unlock the building of homes, of social rent homes, it's all just talk. And I think that's where the challenge is.
Yeah, so there's lots of big stories, isn't there, about kind of homes which are not fit for living in, and mould and being quite a key conversation at the moment. There's certainly an aspect of an understanding around why some of those homes are being demolished, perhaps. I know there's conversation about whether the frames can be retained from an embodied carbon point of view and so on. But in terms of that new build, what's the thing which is holding back the new build of social housing?
I think it's complex. I think there's quite a web of different things. So I think you've got there's land availability is one challenge. You have desire to build social rent homes. And this is where MMC comes in, and is a real opportunity to my mind. Because you have MMC provides a slightly different business, a very different business model actually to your more traditional builds. So not to demonise the traditional house builders, we need them to be doing what they're doing, don't get me wrong. But their business model actually works that if they've got land and they've got planning, you can create more money from the sort of planning uplift. If you've got a pressure in the market and a squeeze and house prices start to fall, as a business model, will you just drip feed your houses slower into the market to increase your prices, right? And it is a business model, and it works, and it is delivering homes. However, that model of slowing down delivery to essentially maximise profit is not going to get us the social rent houses we need. And that's on the kind of private market, that's looking at private buyers, what have you. And then alongside your sort of private buyers, you have your Section 106, which is the affordable housing that goes alongside that. And where there's challenge or where there's a price squeeze or whatever, more than ever, Section 106 housing, your affordable housing that goes alongside your private, gets sort of value engineered out. It gets sort of squeezed out. Okay, but if we deliver that, we can only deliver half of what we've said that we'll deliver affordable housing. And we've got to remember that affordable housing is different to social rent housing. So affordable housing, typically around the country, is 80% of market rates, whereas social housing is much lower than that again. And normally run by local authorities or by housing associations, and therefore is just that much cheaper. And so it's really hard to make the viability stack up to deliver that housing. When you come to MMC, what's brilliant, particularly category 1, category 2, your kind of volumetric or your panelised systems, their business models are built on getting homes built through the factory and delivered on site. That's how they make the money. It's not about the land, it's not about the planning uplift, it's not about the delay and the drip feed. It's about numbers of homes through the factory to create optimal efficiency.
Yeah.
So for a local authority, if I took that seat or that hat, I need homes. I need social rent homes. I need low-cost social rent homes that I can then give to the people that are on the waiting list for the local authority.
Yeah.
What I know is traditional builds. I've got a plan, I've got a model, I've got a process, I've got a system for managing that.
Yeah.
MMC, on the other hand, can deliver me homes quicker, faster, better quality. And now the problem is I don't really understand how to take that through all of my governance, and I don't really understand how that works, and how do we do our contracts, and how do we do our legal work, and how do we do
insurance,
insurance, and who owns which bit when. And I can't just sort of go on site and look, oh, you've built another story, great, tick, there's another payment, because it's all been built off site. And some local authorities are getting around that and working it through, but it's not comfortable and easy. And so I think this is where we get into those delays, and this is where it is possible to deliver quickly, and I think MMC is absolutely crucial for that.
Yeah.
But it's not comfortable, and it's not necessarily easy for a lot of local authorities, particularly, to have to force themselves into a new process and a new system that could be perceived as quite risky.
Yeah. So just unpacking the first part of that, you mentioned about sites and so on. Obviously 300,000 or whatever that target number ends up being. Is that going to be achieved with smaller sites which are currently sort of unlocked, or is there enough scale of that, or is it actually, are we talking here more kind of high volume housing, high density, taller buildings, for example? What's your thoughts on that?
I think it's got to be all of it. Honestly, I think if we're really going to hit the 1.5 million homes that Labour are promising over their, term, it's got to be all of it.
Yeah.
Now, my focus, particularly in what we're doing with the Housing Festival, is looking at the small sites. So there are hundreds of small sites in every local authority that are underutilised. Now, they're difficult and they're complex, and they've often got demolition works that's happened on them previously, or they're stuck down a little old road, or it's an old garage site that's been, loads of people know those garages, those rows of garages that haven't been used for tens of years and overgrown or become ASBO sites or become fly-tipping hotspots or what have you. Those sites are everywhere. Now, they're overlooked and they're not wanted by majority of house builders typically. And to be honest, they're probably not wanted by most of the MMC sector either.
Yeah.
But they are often the sites that local authorities have ownership over, and they are there and they're sitting within existing infrastructure. So if you go and build a big new site on the side of a town, great, you could perhaps bring in 500 new homes, and a quarter of those might be affordable if it's a really progressive scheme.
Yeah.
But what you will also have to build in is a new road network. You'll have to think about the bus transport systems. You'll have to think about doctor surgeries, et cetera, to look at those sort of little brownfield infill sites. They're already within existing infrastructures and already within existing cities, towns, villages, etc. And to add 10 homes in one little corner isn't going to make a massive difference to, say, your local GP surgery. I mean, maybe, but it shouldn't make too much of a difference to a local GP surgery. It's not going to make too much difference to a local bus network or whatever, what have you. It might boost the little corner shop down the road that can then stock a few more things because it's got a few more customers regularly using the shop, So you can really make the most of infrastructure that already exists by looking at those infill sites. The challenge is they're so difficult to develop because the sites are often really awkward, and there's usually so much on it that needs looking at before you can even begin to develop. What we're starting to look at is, how do you aggregate those small sites? How do you bring all those small sites together into one collective lump to sort of make it more worthwhile? Because if you could bring, let's say, 50 of those small sites together, so not even that many, if you look at across one city, there's probably 200, 300, maybe even 400 of those sites. Let's say you can bring 50 together. You can put them out as a whole package, which reduces the risk for a company coming in and going, right, we'll look at all of those. There will be some that will be absolutely undevelopable. But those sites that are undevelopable for housing perhaps could be your biodiversity net gain offset sites. So suddenly the ones that you're looking at that are developable, but you can't do biodiversity net gain on site because it's so constrained, it's so limited. You've got a site you already know you can't develop, but there it is for the biodiversity net gain offset.
Interesting concept,
Yeah, so I think there's, sites are tricky. I think we need to be looking at all of them. We need to be looking at high rise, we need to be looking at big sites, we need to be looking at, but we also need to not overlook what already exists and what's within our, particularly within local authorities' gift, to start to bring together, aggregate for, let's say, an MMC supplier who can bring panels down a tight little lane and into a little garage site and connect it together in a way that's quick and possible.
Yeah. And I guess the other thing is those sites aren't going to get so much controversial feedback as a big development of 500 apartments or something is going to potentially attract.
You would hope so.
Yeah.
Hope so.
The other part of the previous question which you touched on was about the funding models and that sort of thing and how that would actually work. Are you finding that the mindset is still that we need to make this work? This is the way we have to make it work, or is that kind of risk and uncertainty and complexity actually creating a barrier for people adopting MMC?
Yeah, it's definitely a big barrier. I think, there's a lot of people arguing out there that MMC is on a par cost-wise or even cheaper in some cases. It's not what I see. I see MMC, if you compare it like for like, as more expensive.
As in volumetric MMC?
Yeah, or even some of the panelised systems are if you compare it to sort of bricks and mortar. But the problem is, when you compare like that, you're not really comparing like for like.
Yeah.
And I think that's where we trip ourselves up. So I think actually if you start to work out what you really are comparing, it becomes cheaper and it becomes much more manageable, because what you are comparing is, with MMC, you're getting, normally, depending on which business and which company you're going with, you're getting high quality, you're getting low carbon footprint, you're getting low carbon in operation, potentially net zero carbon operation. You're getting a home that you don't need to retrofit in 10 years. You're getting superior quality assurance, superior fire safety, superior
traceability, airtightness, all sorts of things.
And then you get into skills, and you get into the fact that that company has set up a little flying factory or used one of your local factories and employed your local people to put it in on site. There's just some really innovative stuff going on around skills and upskilling people within that sort of MMC sector. Now, that doesn't solve the problem, because I think viability is a real challenge. In so many cases, what I see is the use of something called net present value, the NPV assessment. So you do an assessment of a site, you look at it and you say, right, how many homes can I get on? When will that be paid off by? If I think about 30%, if I'm doing social rent on those homes, then I can't pay that off for 60 years, say. So actually, that's not viable, because I need it to be paid off in 30 years. That's how it all works, right? But actually, I would argue, and I think this is where we need to be pushing the boundaries on this, that for a local authority, they could pay it off over 60 years. You don't need to pay it off in 30 years. Yes, that's the typical, that's the industry standard, sure. But actually, a local authority is investing in social rent homes. If you calculate the difference between putting those out to market rent and putting those out as social rent, essentially, if you look at the difference between what you're going to bring back in as profit, you won't if you do it as social rent, but you could if you did it at market rent, that's the social value that's going into that scheme. Now, not many people think of it in that way, but if you start thinking about it in that way, and you start calculating the impact that having more homes in your borough, in your local authority area, in your city is going to make on those temporary accommodation waiting lists, on the social housing waiting lists, that saving also doesn't get factored in when we look at viability.
What about the cost saving of all that as well? Because it can't be cheap having lots of hotels being paid consistently for 2 years, as you mentioned. Where does that factor into the actual cost?
Well, when it comes to building homes, that doesn't get factored in. So I do a lot of work with different local authorities, and that's one of the first things I say is, how can you factor that cost in? Because that's, let's take a garage site you've built. You've demolished the garages, you put up 10 homes, nestled into an old brownfield site. That's 10 homes that throughout the life of those properties you can use to offset.
Yeah.
You could use for temporary accommodation, or you could use for social rent housing for someone on your social housing waiting list, or as a move on for people that have been in temporary accommodation. And instantly that makes you an annual saving of however much it is for that local authority. But it's the difference between social rent costs and a hotel. Like, it's huge. Over a year, that's a massive amount of money. Over 10 homes, that's a massive amount of money. That's 10 families potentially that could be out of a hotel and into a home. And that doesn't get factored into the development costs. And I think we really need to start doing that, because that's where it really sits. Now, a private developer isn't going to be able to factor in the cost savings of a local authority because they don't bear the brunt of that. But a local authority who owns that land and is bearing the cost of temporary accommodation and social housing waiting lists, they could factor in if they're leading the development, if they're paying for those homes to be built, they could factor that in. It is complicated. I don't want to underestimate the complexity of local authorities' budgets and financial spreadsheets and ring fences of different budgets and all the rest of that. I understand. But there are ways to do it. And I think sometimes we're too scared to push the dial because it's a bit risky and we've never done it before. But how and what? And we need to be asking those questions and forcing that point.
That's an interesting approach. So we talked about the improving of standards and so on by adopting MMC panelised systems and so on. Now, passive house is something which seems to be coming up more and more frequently in this market, in other places in Europe like Netherlands, Ireland, and even over in Canada and places further afield. Are very much passive house is becoming a standard which people are either working to, even if they're not going for the certification. But what is the driver for that? Because there's obviously a certain general movement positively towards circularity, reuse of materials and so on, but passive house obviously slightly different. So what's the big driver, in your opinion, as to why passive house is becoming more widely adopted?
I think there really is a push, isn't there, for climate awareness and the sort of the climate emergency. And that is driving a lot of behaviours now. And that's really positive. That we've seen so many campaigns, exhibitions. We've seen so much movement towards everybody being more aware of climate and sustainability and just being climate aware. And I think that's really positive. It's been really slow, hasn't it? Like over the last however many years, it's been really slow. And, you know, we're not moving fast enough still, but it is positive that we're making steps forward. And so I think this drive towards a passive house standard is recognising, it's the industry, isn't it? Recognising that is important to the rest of the world. That's going to be important to their clients. It's going to be important to local authorities. It's going to be important to private individuals. It's become now up on the agenda so much so that we need to start talking about it.
Is the agenda actually driving different actions within Bristol City Council and other councils around the country and so on? Are we actually seeing awareness now translate into the way they approach? Is that one of the reasons? Is there other factors, like, for example, passive house is probably going to save you money in the running costs, and the cost of living is a big thing everywhere in the world at the moment, isn't it?
I'd like to think the second one, but I do think it's more the first one. I think we are much more seeing people driving towards that sort of general push from the population to be, this is important and we need to look at it. I think that's great. I don't think that's a bad thing. You see it baked into, you know, local authority strategies, corporate strategies. It gets baked into procurement documents in terms of, well, we have to be able to tick box what we're doing to meet standards. And passive house is a really easy tick box of like, yes, I'm passive house standard. It's a really easy, well-known way to say, I'm meeting those credentials. I'm meeting that sustainability marker, as it were. And there's loads of housing and MMC companies particularly that will do basically passive house standard, but they don't have the accreditation. You know, and even that is brilliant. But I think it's much more of a drive to that than necessarily recognising things like the cost saving for individuals, because it works a bit more like that in the private market. If you can buy a house that's not going to cost you anything to run, you're going to be more drawn to that if you've got an option and if you've got choice. But that's where the crucial thing is. Like, I don't know whether you've tried to buy a house anytime recently, but the market across the UK is difficult. Like, I've got friends trying to buy a house at the moment, and just their options are really limited. Like, really limited. They have their budget, and everything is either way above or gone before they can go and do it. You know, and that is the south of England. So perhaps it's different in other spaces and places, but it feels like it's been like that for a while. What we don't have is loads of availability of choice, so that actually those with purchasing power can drive the market, because we don't have the availability of choice, you know?
Yeah, so with those sort of higher standards, of performance standards being adopted now, is that meaning that they also are looking at the viability because they're going, well, I'm not going to need to refurb it as soon? Is that a factor which is getting considered by council and so on? Or?
I'd love to say it was. I don't know that it is. And it may be by some councils. I don't want to damn all councils across the country. I think there is that awareness of that, and those questions are being asked. But ultimately, it's about how much money have I got now, and how many homes can I build now that will fit within my viability window and my viability envelope. And until we start challenging the way we measure viability, and perhaps even arguing for outcomes-led procurement approaches. So actually, what I want is a high-quality, highly sustainable home that I can deliver for social rent. Those would be the outcomes, and then everything else fits around that. Until we start leading with that, rather than I've got X amount of millions and I need as many homes as possible with that, we're not going to be led by those credentials. We're going to be led by the amount of money we've got.
So thinking more kind of long term, often the housing approach does feel quite sort of short term focused. What do you think can be done at the start of projects, actually looking at the sort of future proofing and so on, not just kind of looking at this is how much it's going to cost to build this 10 homes and so on? What's your thoughts about that kind of sort of longer term thinking at an early stage?
I think it's got to be around outcomes. I don't know, we touched on this just a few moments ago, but we've got to really look at outcomes. We've got to look at what do we want to deliver? What's the purpose of this? Rather than just knowing that we need to deliver homes. What type of homes? Are they homes that are going to last? Are they homes that are quick? Are they homes that are sustainable? Or are they homes that are just as quickly on site as possible? You know, what are the outcomes? What are we trying to solve? That's really the key question, I think. You know, why are we doing this? And again, like I said, we work with a lot of different local authorities. And again, one of the first questions I'll ask is why? Why do you want innovative housing? Why do you want this housing at all? Like, what's the driver? Where's your challenge as a local authority? What is it that you're struggling with? Where are your pain points? And how can the housing then shift to support that? If it is about a drive to sustainability and an environmental emergency or an ecological emergency, great. But you can build housing that will support the ecology of the area. You could build housing that is net zero in operation. You could build housing that has a net zero life cycle if you wanted to get into how to measure that. But until you know what you're doing and why.
What's the ambition?
Exactly. You can't deliver homes that are really focused around meeting those ambitions. You just get into how many homes, how big's my site, how much money can I save? And it's too simple.
So what's the common response when you bring up those questions of kind of ambition? What's your ambition? What are the challenges which you're trying to solve here? What are people tending to say?
It tends to be greeted very warmly because actually people want to have those conversations. They want to talk about how we can make this really fit in with a lot of other strategic ambitions across the council. I think often the challenge is it gets lost in iteration. So you might start, for example, in a high-level strategic conversation with councillors or senior members of staff or what have you, or in a housing association with the board or with senior execs. And you start by saying, well, what's the vision? What's the point? What's the purpose? Great, we want low carbon, we want highly sustainable, we want homes that are going to last for 60 years without needing retrofit, we want low maintenance costs, we want housing that's really good for our tenants. Brilliant. Okay, great. And then that sort of is set in stone, I say loosely. It gets written down in perhaps a PID, a project initiation document or something similar, or a purpose document. But then it drives through the process and you get into the details of feasibility and surveys on site and project management and procurement and legal frameworks and insurance and warranties and all those kind of documents and supplier engagement. And in all of those processes, what I tend to witness is that the purpose gets lost in amongst that. And sort of organisations revert back to status quo of, but what's the best, what's the quickest, what's the easiest, what's the cheapest?
So the vision kind of gets diluted as it goes down the funnel.
Exactly.
Towards the build,
And one of the key things is helping organisations and encouraging organisations to hold that key vision at every stage of the process. So every time you do one of those steps, let's say procurement, you then revert back to what's the point? So how do we do procurement which fixes on and fixates on what's the point? It's not about the cheapest. It's about the one that's going to best deliver X, Y, Z, ABC, And then you can build your procurement around that. That's not the problem. The problem is that the vision gets lost at that point. Or it could be in the legal contracts, the vision gets lost. Or in the viability matrix, the vision gets lost. It's not, I don't want to just beat down on procurement colleagues. It's not the way. It's at every stage you can lose that sense of vision. But if you hold to it, you can deliver some really exciting projects, which I've seen delivered, that deliver net zero in operation, housing for young people. There's an example in Bristol, housing for young people that is brilliant. And it's young people coming out of homelessness situations or at risk of homelessness situations that get given a long-term tenancy in a house that's owned by the council at a reasonable rent. And their bills are barely anything because they're living in a really highly sustainable home. They've got built-in things like solar panels that just makes their experience so much better.
That's quite an interesting piece then. So if we're taking kind of the ambition and the vision, we're looking at the challenges and hurdles, which are going to kind of, practicality of the site logistics and so on. If we're kind of to take those two and streamline that process, how would that be streamlined? Is it by innovation? Is it collaboration? What's the missing ingredient to streamline by what?
It's a good question. I mean, I think it's just about holding to those values. I think the streamlining happens when you're willing to hold to those values and don't get taken off course. I think there's loads of different ways to do it. There's loads of innovation. There's loads of tools out there, aren't there? There's loads of organisations that are doing some fantastic work and fantastic components and elements and pods and SIPS panels and all sorts. Like the technology is out there. We're not lacking the technology or the opportunity. We're struggling because it's how do you get that into mainstream deployment, And so if you can hold to the vision in whatever company you are, whether you're, I talk a lot about being a local authority because that's who I work with the most, or a housing association, and holding that strategic marker for delivering a project, a housing project. But actually in the same vein, if you're a contractor, if you're a tier one, if you've just been employed by a council or a local authority to deliver, what are you doing to build in high vision, high sustainability, high quality? How are you delivering that for your client and challenging their way of thinking? So they're going to go for the cheapest, but how are you challenging them to be thinking more broadly? Risky business because you might not get selected. But if you do get selected, you'll be delivering so much more than just lowest cost, cheapest delivery of the basic components. You'll be delivering really high quality stuff that's going to last, that will make a real difference.
That's interesting. So I'm kind of picturing in my mind then you've got the organisations like yourself at the front end kind of opening the mind as to what the vision and ambition really is and being clear about that. And then we've got the construction industry making sure that we've gathered what is important and we understand the challenges of that particular site and so on. And it's certainly for companies like ourselves to help with that, streamlining it by innovation and by actually collaborating together in terms of making complex details simplified and so on in that journey. So
and I think that's really crucial. So that you talked there about collaboration. I was at an event just earlier this week where I was in an exhibition and I was hosting a round table where you had industry talking to industry, the construction industry talking to itself. It was a great conversation. But around that table, we recognised that actually we know what's needed. We know that we have to collaborate. We all know that our clients need to be doing X, Y, and Z, but that's not the opportunity that's often on the table. And I think there's a real sort of piece here, yes, within the construction industry, but also broadly, where we need to stop waiting for someone else to tell us when we can do it. It's too easy to sit back and just go, do you know what? But our clients aren't asking for it. Or as a local authority to sit back and go, well, they're not doing it, so it's too risky. Or, well, that's not what's on offer. It's so easy for each individual person, organisation, actor within this system to go, I'll just wait for someone else to tell me to do it. It's too easy. But we have to collectively, if we want to see change, if we, for our society, want to see improvement that's actually going to solve this country's massive housing challenge, we need to collectively lead the approach. And that's really hard. Leadership is so important. And in every organisation, the organisations that function well because they've got a good leader, good leadership. It might not be that they've got a figurehead who's on the TV all the time or whatever, but they've got somebody or a group of people who know how to lead a team, and manage a team. And they're the organisations that function really well. Nobody's job is to lead the sector. Nobody's job is to lead the industry. There's nobody whose job it is to lead local authorities through and into better procurement and better tenders and better bids and better. We have to collectively come together and lead the change. And I sound like I'm starting a rallying cry for some sort of movement, but there is something about collaboration. And, that same event, I spoke to too many people, and I won't mention any names, that were talking about their IP. And across the MMC sector of all different categories, we're very precious about our IP and our kind of little component or our system, SIP system, or our volumetric modular element or our kind of digital designs for something. And we have to be a bit careful with that because for a client, for a local housing, local authorities housing company, or local authority housing delivery themselves, one of the reasons they don't work with MMC is because if it goes wrong, if the worst happens and that MMC company goes bust, or something like that happens, because everyone's so protected for their own model, there's nothing for another company to pick up and go, oh, I can fit and I can just finish that off for you, and so the whole scheme will fall over. And I've seen devastating effects and millions of pounds wasted on schemes where it's been so closely guarded and protected that no one can pick it up. And the risk then for a local authority is huge because I can only have one person do my site. What happens if they fall over? And that's tricky.
It's interesting because I was at a conference last week where we were talking about exactly the same thing, but it was a real estate conference. So you've got the build to rent. People talk about exactly the same challenges, and one of the things they were talking about is really kind of things that are starting to normalise in more of a kind of panelised system approach where you can standardise some of the details, and you've got companies working together. One of the particular company examples which was being talked about was Quintain working together with CISC as a main contractor, and other companies like Tech Panels and Sapphire Balconies all sort of joining together in a collaborative piece. But I think kind of the common thread from those kind of conversations for what you just talked about there is really about people being diligent about it's actually about kind of working together collaboratively, yes, but diligently bringing stuff to the table which actually solves the complexities of those, particularly the connecting interfaces with each other.
And DLUC, now MHCLG, but when it was DLUC, did a piece of work. They commissioned a piece of work around a digital kit of parts, looking particularly at the interoperability of certain categories of MMC and how you can standardise some of the interfaces to look at this specifically and try and lead it from the top. That sort of in the change of government and the shift from DLUC to MHCLG and all the rest of it has kind of stalled a little bit. And I'm really hoping that piece of work gets picked back up and taken forward, because not because we want all of the different components to look the same, but if they can operate, if they can interface well, and there is an interoperability that is standardized across the sector, we're going to make ourselves so much more robust, so much more robust for the whole sector. And that'll enable us to keep moving forward, and for clients, particularly local authority, housing associations, etc., to really rely on that robustness because of the interoperability and the collaboration between the parties and the partners. And I find it so distressing. I'm being very over dramatic, but it is quite sad when you look at these companies that are so protective of their thing. I'm like, there is so much business out there that even if all the companies put their IP up on screen, up on a website for anybody to copy and paste, there's so much business. I don't think it would be a problem. Now, that's me with a very kind of, risk, open risk appetite, like fine. And I get that won't be the same for every company, but I do think we need to be pushing ourselves as an industry to be a little bit less protective and a little bit less defensive of each other, and actually recognise how much need, how much business, how much opportunity there is out there, and just relax a little bit so that we can work more collaboratively across the sector.
The bit which needs working out with that IP as a product manufacturer, it's expensive to invest into testing, into innovation and so on. Now, it's also fundamentally important for businesses to get ahead and successfully outpace the industry. So there is that kind of working together and working out what the middle ground is of actually sharing IP, working out interfaces and where things can collectively build up the pipeline for everyone to be able to successfully work together in a much more streamlined way. And I think that's definitely a good ambition which we need to be thinking about from both ends of the construction industry. If I may, one last question, but a bit of a curveball if I'm allowed. The BSR gateways have become a very, very topical point with so many schemes stuck. There's a lot of silence around that at the moment from the BSR. Is it the BSR gateways versus 300,000 new homes? Is that is there at some point in the near future the two of them going to collide? What's your thoughts or opinions on that?
Oh, it is a good question. Honestly, I think the danger is that we get caught up in the middle of the conversation and to slightly avoid the question in many respects. I don't think it's about that. I think, going back to an earlier point, we have to hold to the vision. Like, what's the point? What are the point of the gateways? What's the point of the 300,000 homes? What are we trying to drive to? We're trying to drive towards quality. We're trying to drive towards social outcomes for this country. We're trying to drive towards not falling off a cliff edge in terms of quality and sustainability and safety and all these things. Yeah. So the challenge will be not pitting the two against each other, but making sure we hold to the vision. Like the point is people safety. The point is quality. The point is actual real outcomes for people to have homes to live in, because gateways and safety and quality don't mean anything if we don't build anything and we don't get and everybody's living on the streets. Equally, it's no good having people in housing that is going to collapse on them or is going to go up in flames or is going to cause them all sorts of health dramas for lack of ventilation and whatever, what have you. So they can't be pit against each other. They just can't.
We need all of it.
We have to hold. We have to hold to the vision that is, we need more homes. This 300,000 a year, the 1.5 million in the parliamentary term homes is a lovely number, and it's too easy to call it just like a tagline or a badge or a subheading or whatever. Ultimately, we have to have those for this country to continue to survive. And we have not been delivering that for years. There is already a tipping point now where we're seeing more councils not being able to cope with the fact we don't have enough housing. So what do we do? What do we do if we just focus on that debate of housing versus gateways and standards and quality? And we can't. We can't get stuck there. So we have to keep pushing forward.
There's obviously considerable complex situation there for the government to unravel.
Absolutely.
And it's going to be important for them to unravel that fast to achieve that 1.5 million homes you mentioned earlier. But Jess, we really appreciate your input. Thank you very much for your time today, and looking at a really complex situation in a way we've really delved into the detail and some of the thinking about that. It's been really insightful, and appreciate your input today. And to all the listeners, thank you for joining us, and we'll be shortly looking at the next step in the journey of looking at MMC and how that's being driven by the government and so on.
Brilliant. Thanks for having me.
Thank you very much, Jessie.